Hey there, folks. The number one Pestilence fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Pestilence record, Levels of Perception. This is an album. Look, it feels pretty natural for any band or artist to kind of lose their luster over time. In fact, I would even say it is unreasonable to expect a band that has been around kicking for decades in the same genre to constantly recapture the magic that they once found at a universally agreed upon creative peak at some point or another, especially when in a lot of those cases those peaks were literal decades ago at this point, which is why I don't go into a lot of multi-decade old bands expecting some of the best material that they've ever put out. And honestly, I think I enjoy a lot of that stuff more for taking that approach. I think too many people try and look at things through the lens of a band that is just as good as they were multiple album cycles ago, instead of just looking at them as a veteran band that's still managing to, keep on keeping on. And hey, just as that can be said about literally any genre of music on this planet, from bluegrass to gore grind, it can be said about various forms of extreme metal, it can be said about death metal. And no matter what, even if you don't click with new releases from bands like, say, Autopsy or Immolation or Dying Fetus, bands that have released albums recently that are death metal veterans that have, been fairly well received, even if you don't click with their newer material, you can at least walk away going, hey, they tried. They really did. I might have not enjoyed that, but I can at least appreciate the fact that this band is continuing to keep on doing their thing in a way that feels impassioned nonetheless as they enter their 50s, 60s in some cases, etc., etc. Now, I feel like you don't have to like every album put out by a legendary band, but there's something to admire in a band continuing to try decades into their career. Then there's Pestilence. Pestilence, Dutch death metal band who put out a series of very well-loved, well-liked albums throughout the 90s, before kind of going pretty undiscussed in a lot of death metal circles, only really having their fan base be the ones that are putting a ton of credit towards them, but nonetheless, they are a fairly notable name within that realm of thrash death fusion. However, their return to recording full-length studio albums in 2009 has pretty much non-stop resulted in records that are seen as not much of note. They've never really put out anything that's blown people away, but I don't think I've ever really seen anyone be outright offended by the lack of quality in any of the more recent Pestilence releases. I mean, for the most part, it's mostly just their fan base that's always existed, checking out their new material without a loss of fans or an expansion of that fan base, for the most part at least. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. There are plenty of great bands that are at that point in their career, and honestly, that doesn't sound like the worst place to be in terms of career placement, maintaining that consistent fan base, still looking out for your new releases. And now we're here at Levels of Perception, and it's just really interesting, I'll say that. Look, if their initial choice to release Levels of Perception, a record composed of them re-recording older material from throughout their discography with the most horrendously ugly AI-generated cover art in the first place, wasn't enough to really just demonstrate to you the sheer amount of laziness that goes into this record, then I feel like the music itself pretty much drives home a burning question, which is, what the fuck happened to Pestilence? Jesus Christ, man, this is rough. Alright, the most immediately obvious quality about Levels of Perception that a lot of people, including myself, have very major gripes with is the sound quality itself. I mean, this is a record that unashamedly sounds like it was recorded by an MP3 player with the world's tiniest microphone, and the original source of the audio was a shitty burned CD anyway, so there was just no hope at all of there being anything here in terms of good sound quality. I mean, some of the other comparisons that I've seen made for this record are that it sounded like it was recorded with a Nokia, or that it was recorded through a really thick layer of bubble wrap. And while I can't personally take claim for those two comparisons, I can definitely say they are extremely accurate. This album sounds shockingly bad. I mean, genuinely, I don't think I could ever describe the lack of quality in the sound design on this record fully. I feel like if you want to get the gist of what I'm getting at here, just go listen to a quarter of a song from this album and you will see what I mean. I went through multiple listening devices to hear this album, to give it the few listens that I did before I reviewed it. I went through headphones, I went through earbuds, fuck, I went through a laptop speaker just because I genuinely thought that the materials that I had at hand, my equipment, was broken. I thought it wasn't working correctly because no music, even music that is created on the lowest of the low budgets, sounds like this, at least not intentionally, and I don't think it was intentional here. If it was, that scares me. Look, I will say I do think that calling anything unlistenable based on sound quality, based on, Sonic's production, blah 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 alone, I think that's kind of a stretch. No matter what album you're talking about, there's so many other factors that go into making an album quote unquote unlistenable. But if there was ever an album, at least this year, if there was an album that came out so far in 2024 that I would describe as unlistenable based on production alone, I mean, here you have it. This is especially painful when you consider the entire brand of Pestilence, the entire nature of death metal, both of which being very reliant on being impactful, being devastating sonically, the kind of things that you associate with extreme metal, with extreme music, just not being here at all. It takes so much away from the listening experience. Like you're hearing the first ever demos that Pestilence put out when they were 15 years old, except they are multiple decades into their career at this point in time. It just feels so bizarre to hear it, and it almost sounds like they were maybe trying to go for something a little bit more raw here. Perhaps they were trying to go for the more legitimately lo-fi sound, and if that was the case, then I guess they succeeded by technicality. But I don't think it was, because if that really was the case, Pestilence trying to go in a more raw direction, going back to their roots, so to speak, I don't think it would sound nearly as dull as it does here. There are so many proper, raw, thrashy death metal bands out there right now that can be produced well while also still maintaining that very garagey kind of quality. Pestilence get that garagey kind of quality here, but only because they sound terrible and their performances are mediocre at best, and I'll touch on that in a moment. If anything, I will say it's nearly remarkable that Pestilence have managed to achieve the opposite issue that most classic metal bands are having right now. I mean, we are in an era where a lot of old school metal bands of a variety of walks of sound are on labels like Nuclear Blast, where they are being overpolished to death. They are being so overproduced that they just feel completely soulless, completely taking any real energy out of their records. And here, Pestilence have put out a record that sounds like you went to see a Pestilence tribute band at a club or bar, but they didn't let you enter, so you just stood in the alley outside and pressed your ear against a concrete wall, hoping to hear any slight semblance of music. That's about as close as I can possibly describe what this album sounds like in terms of production. It truly is that awful. And hey, while the sound quality may be the immediate biggest offender here on this record, there are various other blunders that Pestilence take the time to add to this record that just ensure that there's no real salvaging it in the first place. I mean, if you can get through the audio soup of the production and mix here on this record, then you're going to be greeted by some of the most uninteresting, uninspired, and passionless performances that you could rise out of any veteran metal band at this point. I mean, when you hear people criticize certain classic extreme metal bands for releasing records today that feel lacking in innovation, one can only imagine that those same people find the most recent Cannibal Corpse record to sound really great after hearing this, at least significantly better, because here on this record, it's just filled with instrumentals that are tedious, they're boring, they feel like complete copy and paste jobs of the most basic tech death, thrash death instrumentals that you've ever heard in your entire life. It's kind of amazing how Pestilence can manage to sound like every single mediocre band of their style that you've ever heard, while at the same time adding a certain degree of sloppiness just to really tie things together and ensure that this album isn't just slightly below average, but genuinely bad. A number of the guitar solos here in particular managed to feel especially off the mark, so to speak. Tracks like Dehydrated, featuring these solo passages that feel like more noodling for the sake of it than anything that actually comes off as memorable or especially intense. And otherwise, the drums feel ineffective and tinny. The vocals fail to maintain any degree of aggression or guttural quality that I feel really they do need to succeed in the context of a record like this. And the bass lines, while having a relatively decent tone, does not fit the record whatsoever in any capacity, especially when you consider how buried they can often feel, as well as how lacking in punch they can often feel due to the production of this record. Look, maybe there was, at first, some potential for levels of perception to be salvageable, maybe just be not bad, or to just be mediocre because it had some awful production but okay performances, but some of the completely lackluster instrumentals that you find here that feel like significantly dulled versions of the original tracks that are featured on this record, they just allow this album to fall from not much of importance to genuinely one of the worst albums that I've ever heard from a veteran extreme metal band. Then again, it almost feels wrong to give Levels of Perception any credit of being a potentially almost not awful album to any extent, besides the fact that it is awful. It's also what this record ultimately represents in general, both for Pestilence and just in the overall creative landscape of metal in general. I mean, as I stated earlier, the initial AI cover art for this album was a telling sign of things to come before it was released, and they were rightfully bullied into changing it, which is why bullying is okay sometimes, but the very concept of Levels of Perception just feels uninspired, as it compromises the entire point of re-recording music in the first place. I've nothing against the idea, but this album serves no purpose. This is just a record comprised of Pestilence re-recording some tracks from various points in their discography so poorly that they sound like bad tribute versions recorded for a Guitar Hero game. They don't even sound like actual Pestilence. They are so poorly produced, almost bit-crushed at times, and you know, there's nothing wrong with trying to put a new spin on old tracks for the sake of putting out a new record. I have nothing against that. There are so many examples throughout many genres of music where artists do that. They re-record a song they put out long ago for the sake of updating it in some way or another. I'm fine with that, but that's where the issue with this album comes in. They don't do anything new with it. Like I said, it's just a copy and paste, but instead of improving the songs at all, they just make them significantly worse. I mean, there's nothing fresh here. There's nothing original here. I think as a whole, this is a record that relies on some classic songs as a crutch. It relies on classic records like Consuming Impulse and Testimony of the Ancients to draw listeners in, listeners who are fans of that classic run of albums, or even the really diehard fans that are a fan of the post-reunion albums. I think that this is just an album that's meant to draw in Pestilence fans because it has songs that they know on it. But the songs that they know on it are so much worse than the songs that they actually know, the original versions of these songs. It's kind of baffling in that sense, and I almost nearly respect the lack of effort that went into this in terms of production, in terms of performance, in terms of concept, but the final result is just almost depressing. Look, maybe there's something wrong with expecting any band to really just knock it out of the park with re-recordings of their older material, but then at that point, there's still the question, if that is true, what is the point of re-recording your old material? And if Pestilence went into this record hoping to answer that question, I will say I walk out of it way more confused than I was when I went into it, because I genuinely don't see who cleared this record, who thought it was a good idea, who thought the final product here was worth actually putting out there as something that you can purchase with actual money, that you can actually spend time listening to. It's baffling. And the craziest part is, I don't think that this is a complete and total failure of an album. Pestilence is a group of competent musicians who just very obviously did not put that much time and effort even into this record, despite the fact that it's meant to be this quote-unquote monstrous release for the Pestilence fan base. And I think that shows in a lot of places, from the lackluster instrumentals to the god-awful production to the fact that the original AI art on the cover was, again, AI. I think it's fair to say that as far as classic death metal bands go, Pestilence have never really been the biggest name out there. I mean, even if you compare them to the much smaller, more niche category of sort of death-thrash fusion bands, I personally have seen more people talk about Kreator, more people talk about Demolition Hammer, but that doesn't stop there being one true fact about Pestilence. They, at one point, had a pretty impeccable discography. Even if you don't like a lot of the post-reunion records, which, I mean, even I personally don't, I don't think there's any denying that their output in the 90s is among the classic of the classics as far as that decade for death metal goes. Consuming Impulse, in particular, really just a phenomenal record and a must-hear essential album for death metal fans. And now, here we are. How the fuck did we get here? Having a sort of late career comeback from Pestilence would have been nice, especially considering that there are a lot of death metal bands pulling that off right now, but I think it would have been possible if they had just done anything remotely unique with the songs that they chose to rework here. Even if it was just, I don't know, chopping things up so certain progressions were different, or just taking a different approach to the solos, or literally anything, because ultimately, the pool of songs that is here is just a bland, horrifically bad take on the original versions of these tracks, some of which in the first place were great, some of which not so much, but instead, at the end of the day, no matter what songs here you like or dislike the original versions of, the end result is just an embarrassment of a record with bafflingly low energy performances that's only ever really trumped by even worse, shocking levels of production that make me question how this was even able to be okayed in the first place for release. Maybe this record was doomed from the start, or perhaps there was a small chance that it was actually going to be mildly okay. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that when the AI cover art dropped, I didn't have super high expectations, and I'm glad that they got bullied into changing it, because that's just cheap as hell and makes me lose a huge degree of respect for anyone creatively. But I digress. All of that aside, I think the reality of Levels of Perception as an album is that it is just nothing short of a disaster, and as far as metal bands go, I don't see a worse metal album dropping this year. Hell, I barely see a worse album in general dropping this year, but that's neither here nor there. I'm going to give this record 1 star out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.